Hi, I'm Andrew Maxwell with the Canadian Innovation Centre, and I'm delighted to be here with Michael Raynor in sunny Mississauga to talk about his new book, The Innovator's Manifesto. Michael, thank you so much for inviting us into your house.
No, it's my pleasure. Welcome.
Well, maybe we could start by talking a little about your book and a little bit about the previous books that you've done around the Innovator's Solution and the Strategy Paradox.
Sure. Well, I'll turn the clock back a little bit more than that, if you'll permit me. So my work in innovation focuses pretty much exclusively on the notion of disruption and disruptive innovation. And for those folks who make a study of innovation, they'll know that disruption was, as a theory at least, was discovered by Clayton Christensen, who's a professor at the Harvard Business School. And Clay articulated that theory for the first time to a broad business audience in his 1997 book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which was fabulously successful. Clay ran a couple of doctoral seminars at HBS when I was doing my doctorate there. So I had the opportunity to work with him and meet with him and become familiar with his work. And out of that, we ended up collaborating on The Innovator's Solution, which came out in 2003. As you point out, The Innovator's Solution was intended to address some of the practical implementation problems associated with pursuing disruptive innovation deliberately. And out of a lot of that work, I started wrestling with a couple of other questions, which was for all the case evidence that supported disruption theory and for the compelling nature of the theoretical arguments, there was kind of irreducible uncertainty, and it was a material amount of irreducible uncertainty. You know, you can think you understand how things are going to work, but in the innovation sphere, at least, a lot of what you hear is the notion that the key to success is sort of a classic evolutionary metaphor, right? Variation, selection, retention, and the notion that organizations need to let 1,000 flowers bloom, they need to fail fast. All of this will be very familiar to your audience, I'm sure. That's advice that's born of the fact, frankly, that we really can't pick winners in advance with any material certainty. And so I started wrestling with that problem in the strategy paradox, which is to say, when you are faced with this kind of irreducible uncertainty, how do you plan and make commitments when you don't know what to commit to? And so from that was born this notion of strategic options, and that felt to me like a way to cope with that problem. What we've tried to do in the Innovator's Manifesto is, I think, a complementary but very different approach, which is to say, wait a minute, what if disruption theory actually can help you pick the winners with a greater degree of certainty? I think uncertainty will always be with us, to be sure, but the story of human progress is the story of making predictable and repeatable the things that previously seemed largely random. And so I think one of the key contributions, I hope, in the new book, The Innovator's Manifesto, is the notion that disruption theory really does help us make predictions. We can pick winners better than we thought. And so what I've tried to do is to demonstrate that fact, to provide evidence of predictive power, as opposed to what tends to happen in a lot of research in social sciences, which is to simply demonstrate explanatory power, right? Our ability to look at the past and explain why it turned out as it did, which is a worthwhile undertaking. But that's very different from showing that we can in fact predict what will happen.
Are you suggesting that they can actually take some of those high-risk projects and identify ways to reduce that risk so that they're not so far out of there? Yeah,
well, so two things, because I think there's, let me answer that question and then kind of turn it a little bit, which is that what I tried to talk about in Strategy Paradox was a way to reduce the risk of things that were intrinsically uncertain. So the whole notion of creating options and so forth, and sort of my take on a lot of tools and approaches that are in general circulation, and I tried to synthesize them in a particular sort of way. But then there's another approach, which is not so much about reducing the risk of something that's intrinsically uncertain. It's about understanding which projects, in fact, aren't really that risky. They look risky because we just don't know. But what I argue in the Innovator's Manifesto is that through the careful application of disruption theory, you can actually pick off the ones that have intrinsically a materially higher probability of success. So you're not so much reducing risk as simply identifying the low-risk opportunities, despite the fact that they might have looked risky. What Innovator's Manifesto shows, I hope, in some small way, is that actually we can understand which things are risky and which aren't, right, by their very nature. So, for example, to get into some of the details about how we tried to show this, Intel Corporation, right? Everybody who hasn't heard of Intel, very graciously made available to us the business plans and the survival data on a portfolio of 48 very early stage businesses that they provided seed financing for, with an eye to actually creating successful new businesses from within Intel. And Intel really in many ways adopted, nearly as I can tell, very state-of-the-art managerial approaches to these sorts of problems, right? They started small, they took small incremental steps with these very early stage businesses, seed financing, good people, great ideas, I mean, all the things that you're supposed to do. And they had precisely the kind of experience that you would expect, which is that some succeeded and many didn't, and that's because that's the way it goes, right? I mean, none of us is of the view that somehow you're supposed to have a 90% success rate. That's just, if you're trying something new and uncertain, you're going to run into these, you're going to have that kind of a performance profile. It's just the way it is. And so we had the long run survival rate on this underlying portfolio of businesses, and it came out something around 10%. So 10% of the 48, slightly better, 5 out of the 48 businesses that they funded survived. And is that good or bad? It seems pretty good to me. Intel's the only company that I've had the privilege of working with that has made available that level of detailed data. So I don't really have an appropriate benchmark, but there are the data, and it looks like state-of-the-art approach, perfectly reasonable outcome as nearly as I can tell. And what it shows is that disruption theory actually demonstrably improves your ability to predict which businesses will be successful and which won't. And so as a result, that's not managing uncertainty.
No.
Right? That's reducing it by picking ideas that are likelier to succeed intrinsically. And that, I think, is a very different way of thinking about the challenges associated with innovating predictably and repeatedly and efficiently. And one of the things that gets me excited about the ability of disruption to make this kind of a difference in our predictive powers, if you will, is that it makes the decision criteria very explicit. In the work that I've done, I've had an opportunity to work with any number of corporations of all kinds of sizes and people who've tried to innovate in any number of ways. And one of the pieces of feedback that I get from folks who get turned down, of course, is they say, well, if only management understood what a genius I am and how great my ideas is, that I would have received backing. And there's always this view that somehow the selection criteria are arbitrary. Right. You sort of, after the fact, you look at the portfolio of initiatives that have been funded, and very often people will say, but wait a minute, how come that one got through and not mine? I can't tell the difference. Was it the management team? Was it the technology? Was it the market? Was it the timing? And was it the competitive price? They're always looking for what are the key levers and how do I create a business plan that has a probability of getting approved and being successful, because it always seems to be this very idiosyncratic sort of ad hoc type process. And frankly, that's not a criticism that I'm levying, right? It's an observation on how things look when, frankly, innovation for most organizations, understandably, is really more art than science. And it behaves that way because we haven't had the tools or the tests required to tell us which theories and approaches actually make us better. We don't know. We've got a bunch of competing explanations, but nothing that's built on an evidentiary foundation that points to improvements in predictive power. So again, when I think about what I've done, or tried to do at least in Manifesto, I try and encapsulate it this way, which is that it's a modest claim, right? From 10% to 15%. I'm not confused, right? I think that's material, but it's a long way from 100. So it's a modest claim, but it's vigorously made, right? I think it's important. I think it makes a difference. And my hope is that it's a step in the direction toward making innovation more science than art.
The single biggest killer of innovation, or one of them, that I find is that when people submit ideas and they don't get feedback on why some are accepted and why some are not accepted. And therefore, what I would kind of embellish what you're saying is that not only is having a process a really good idea for selecting ideas, but communicating that process, why some don't get accepted and some do, is actually a massive catalyst for more innovation in two ways. One is people don't feel, I just got rejected, it was because the guy was having a bad day, right? They actually
didn't like me, I took his parking space.
And secondly, and I've seen this a lot, obviously with new ventures a lot as well, that you find a fundamental flaw in the business. There really is a major problem. but that doesn't mean it can't be resolved. So then you go away and say, you know what, there's such a major problem here. Unless I can do something about that, I'm not going to be successful. And you go away and you work on that, and by having this framework to look at, you can actually eliminate that barrier. And so it has two mechanisms. One is the kind of feedback mechanism, and the second is the actual just communication awareness of the process. So it's actually very valuable.
No, and that's fascinating. There's two things that your comment makes me think about. One is, I think it was Oscar Wilde, it was the old saw, said the greatest barrier to communication is the belief that it has happened. And so I couldn't agree more with the importance of communication. And my suggestion would be that we think about whether some of what's in Manifesto might actually facilitate that, because they are explicit, actionable, and demonstrably communicable, if you will, frameworks and perspectives on what counts as criteria for a potentially successful innovation. So one of the criticisms that has been leveled against disruption theory, and indeed any innovation theory or framework, is that, well, you've got this term, right? It's disruptive or sustaining. It's a core competence or it's not, or pick it. And there's always a debate on whether something qualifies, right? Does it meet the criteria or it doesn't? And there's kind of endless arm wrestles, and you feel like you're sort of a medieval theologian trying to determine what the meanings of definitions might be. What the evidence in Manifesto would suggest is that for whatever ambiguities there might be, large groups of people can in fact learn and apply the theory successfully in a relatively short period of time. So I'm not suggesting that somehow it's completely unambiguous and it's cut and dried every single time, but I have evidence that people can learn it and use it in a way that makes a positive difference. So it seems like it contributes to this communication requirement, which I think can only be a good thing.
Do you have examples from the case studies that you looked at with Intel of specific things where they, using a disruption approach, could actually have helped them make better decisions?
Well, certainly Intel has adopted different dimensions of disruption theory in ways that they feel are helping them make better decisions over time. And in the book, as you might expect, I attempt to unpack some specific examples of how this is in fact played out. And the one that I probably spend the most time with is at Johnson & Johnson, a company, again, that many people will be familiar with, large, diversified life sciences and healthcare company. And we've had the privilege of working with them over a number of years on a project that has become the Sedasis automated sedation system. And so what I try to do in Manifesto is show how a management team, an executive leadership team, can actually adopt a theoretical perspective on what makes for a successful innovation and apply it in a way that allows them to, again, rather than, let 1,000 flowers bloom, see what lives or dies, and then run with that, in fact, focus on a particular area that they felt was ripe for innovation, shape the ideas and the technologies that they had access to in a way that they felt would allow them to be successful, and stick with it to the point that now, in my opinion at least, I think Sedasis is quite likely to be precisely the kind of success that J&J hopes it will be.
So one of the challenges I find is that people tend to view new technology as being a disruptive technology, and of course some technology has a potential to be disruptive and others doesn't. Also, there's kind of a recent trend to look at business models as ways of disrupting the market, but I think you think that you need to have both to be disruptive?
Yeah, that's one of what I hope will be an advance of disruption theory in Innovators Manifesto, because I've tried to stay away from a couple of things. First of all, I don't want to be a disruption bigot. Right? It's not as though the only innovations worth having are the disruptive innovations. Technological innovations that push the frontier of the possible, that are a real breakthrough with existing solutions in existing markets, that's fantastic. Similarly, I think there's a trend for people to think, well, no, it's all about business models and we had it wrong, the technology really doesn't matter. Well, that doesn't seem right either. And neither of those by themselves, in my view, is sufficient to be truly disruptive. Disruptive innovation is a particular category of innovation, a particular type. I think it's especially valuable, but other kinds of innovation are valuable as well. What makes disruption different, I think, is that it is a particular type of combination of both a business model innovation and a technological innovation. And I spend an entire chapter unpacking the history of Southwest Airlines. My view is that we've kind of missed what actually allowed it to be successful when and how it was successful. So let me tell you precisely what I mean by that. Southwest created a unique business model in the airline business, right? The low-cost carrier airline business, and it has the characteristics that many of us are deeply familiar with, right? The notion of point-to-point route structures, one class of plane, no class of service, no advanced seating, all the various attributes that in fact have made Southwest remarkably profitable over an extraordinary period of time in the airline business, which is a very competitive space and where it's very difficult to be profitable consistently. And Southwest has done it thanks to their business model. The interesting thing from my perspective is that Southwest's stock didn't really take off, if you'll pardon the pun, until about 1990, 1991. But it was the same business model since they got off the ground in 1972. So from 1972 to 1990, they were profitable, but they weren't growing, and their stock wasn't the standout performer that it became between 1990 and 2000. So I don't know about you, but I have a tough time explaining things that change in terms of things that don't. So if the business model didn't change, but the stock went bananas, what changed? Well, what changed in my view was what I call the enabling technology of that business model, which was the 737. And in the late 80s, the 737-500 came onto the market, and the 500 had a much lower operating cost. And all of a sudden, Southwest was able to fly much longer routes. And that's when it started to grow, when it became a competitor in the national air carrier space in the United States. And that's when its stock grew very rapidly for almost a decade, making it one of the highest performing equities in all of the U.S. economy, dot-com bubble included, I should point out. Truly remarkable performance. That was a consequence of the combination of a unique business model enabled by a particular technology. And it's the combination of those two things, in my view, that allows something to be truly disruptive. Either by itself, a fabulous innovation worth having. Put the two together, and that's where you get the disruptive magic. One of the things that I try and suggest in Manifesto is that what this means is that we can now be really very deliberate about it, right? In terms of when building a business model, what kinds of technologies do we build the business model around? Do we build it around technologies that improve in one particular dimension of performance at a particular pace, or do we try and make it a point to grab onto technologies that evolve rapidly in a direction that we want to go? And we can do that far more deliberately. They went with what made sense. The idea then is that you can actually be very deliberate about these choices, right? So Southwest ended up being disruptive 20 years after they were founded as an airline, because it took that long before their enabling technology delivered the performance cost profile that they needed in order to be disruptive. Other organizations can make other choices now, understanding what drives their disruptive growth. So they can be far more deliberate about it, and as a consequence, make better predictions. We're back to that theme. Absolutely. Better predictions around when they will be disruptive, because you know what? The trajectory of technological improvements is actually something we can predict with remarkable accuracy.
Right. How should they approach innovation in their organizations differently? What's the things that they should start to look at doing differently?
Yeah, well, I think we alluded to it inside, right? This notion that, for me at least, I think that there's an important, if you'll forgive the phrase, it's somewhat hackneyed, there's an important paradigm shift here, again, from this notion of variation, selection, retention, the idea that innovation is fundamentally unpredictable and uncertain, and so our defense against our own ignorance is diversification, right? Try a lot of different things, try and fail fast, learn quickly, adapt, right? That's that sort of approach to something that I think is more nearly, if you'll forgive me, more nearly scientific, something that is more deliberate, based on a belief that we actually do have a set of principles that give us some insight into the underlying causal mechanisms. And with that understanding, we can in fact achieve the outcomes we desire, not by luck, which is the way I think most approaches to innovation look at this problem, but rather much more nearly by design.